July 6, 1944, Normandy, France. 6:47 in the morning. A German sniper pulls the trigger. An American soldier drops face first into the mud of a sunken lane and never gets up. The sniper's hand moves before the body stops falling. Lift, pull, push, lock. He fires again. Another American goes down. He fires a third time. 3 shots. 3 kills. 11 seconds. The kind of work that takes most soldiers a lifetime to master. And then the Americans shoot back. Not one at a time. Not in careful, measured volleys. What comes roaring back down that lane is something the German sniper has never heard in 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front. It is a wall. A continuous, rolling, overlapping storm of fire that does not pause, does not breathe, does not stop to work a bolt. Shot after shot after shot, faster than any human hand should be able to manage. And it does not end. The sniper presses himself into the dirt. Leaves shred above his head. Bark explodes from the tree beside him. And somewhere in the chaos, he hears something small and strange. A thin metallic ping, like a coin dropped on a stone floor. And then the fire continues anyway, just as fast, just as relentless. He is one of the best marksmen in the German army. He has 3 years of war behind him and one of the finest rifles ever manufactured in his hands. And in this moment, none of it matters even slightly. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next exciting videos. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community, and let's discover history together. Because the men coming for him do not need to be better soldiers than he is. They only need to be there in numbers. Ordinary farm boys and city clerks and mechanics. Men who had never fired a weapon before their recruiting office. Each one armed with a rifle designed by a soft-spoken, half-deaf French-Canadian immigrant who never earned a single dollar from his invention, who would never see a battlefield, who was working quietly in a government arsenal in Massachusetts. While the world prepared to tear itself apart, more than 4 million of those rifles would be built, enough to put one into the hands of every American infantryman who crossed an ocean to fight. And the German soldier in that hedgerow, with all his skill and all his experience, was about to learn what the rest of the world's armies had not yet figured out. The war would not be won by the better marksman. It would be won by the better factory. This is the story of the M1 Garand, and of the quiet immigrant who built it. And of the morning, the world's most battle-hardened army picked one up off a dead American soldier, turned it over in their hands, and understood. Too late that they had already lost. To understand why this rifle mattered so much, you have to go back to 1939 and understand what every soldier on Earth was carrying. Because in 1939, the standard infantry rifle of nearly every major military power was a bolt-action weapon whose fundamental design had not changed in any meaningful way since the First World War. The Germans had the Karabiner 98K. The British had the Lee Enfield. The Soviets had the Mosin Nagant. The Japanese had the Arisaka. Was a well-made, accurate, dependable weapon. And each shared a single critical limitation that every general and weapons designer in the world had simply accepted as an unchangeable fact of war. After every single shot, the soldier had to stop shooting. He had to remove his hand from the trigger, grip the bolt handle, lift it up and pull it backward to eject the spent cartridge, then push it forward to chamber the next round and lock it down before he could fire again. A trained man could do this quickly, faster than most people imagine. A skilled British soldier with a Lee Enfield, drilling until the motion was part of his muscle memory, could put 15 rounds per minute downrange with reasonable accuracy. That was the absolute ceiling, achieved only by experts who had practiced for years. But he could not do it without stopping. And in that pause, however brief, his rifle was not a weapon. It was a club. He was not shooting at the enemy. He was vulnerable. The world's military establishments had thought carefully about this problem and arrived at a consensus answer. The self-loading rifle, the kind that used the energy of each fired cartridge to automatically eject the spent case and chamber the next round, was a foolish idea that soldiers did not need and armies could not afford. The experts laid out their objections with great confidence. First, they said, ordinary soldiers would waste ammunition. Give a man a rifle that fires itself, and he will spray bullets wildly, burning through his supply wagons in an afternoon instead of making each shot count. Second, they argued, the mechanism required to make a rifle self-loading was inherently complex, full of small moving parts, gas ports, springs and pistons that would clog with mud, freeze in cold, and jam at exactly the wrong moment. War is dirt and chaos, the experts said, and simple mechanical systems survive it. Complex ones fail. Third, and perhaps most deceptively, they calculated that producing self-loading rifles in the quantities required to arm millions of soldiers was simply impossible. The manufacturing tolerances required were too tight, the skilled labor too scarce, the cost too high. Better, the consensus held, to trust the bolt action. Trust the trained marksman. Trust the craft of war as it had always been. And so the German army went to war in 1939 with a rifle whose operating principle had been finalized in the 1880s. The Japanese army went to war in 1941 with a weapon that would not have looked out of place in the trenches of the Somme. Every major military power on Earth had examined the possibility of a self-loading infantry rifle and decided, with great confidence, that it was not worth the effort. Every major military power except one. But before we get to the rifle, we need to understand the man who built it. Because John Cantius Garand is one of the strangest and most important figures in the history of American warfare, and almost no one has ever heard his name. He was born in 1888 in Saint Roch, Quebec, the eighth of 12 children in a French-Canadian family that worked whatever work it could find. The Garands were not wealthy. They were not educated beyond what the local schools could provide before children were needed on the factory floor. When John was still a boy, his family crossed the border into New England. Drawn by texts that were consuming immigrant labor by the thousands in the towns. Along the Connecticut and Mappapemic rivers, John Garand left school early and went to work, not because he had no ability, but because there was no money for anything else, and because the factory floor turned out to be exactly where his particular kind of genius lived. He was, by every account from people who worked beside him, not a rebel-looking man, quiet, modest to the point of self-effacement. He went partially deaf as a young man, which made him somewhat withdrawn in conversation, more comfortable with tools than with people. He loved ice skating, which he did with genuine elegance on any frozen pond he could find in a New England winter. He had large, careful hands and eyes that could see in 3 dimensions what most men could only imagine. What he had, in a quantity that almost no one around him recognized at first, was an intuitive understanding of how machines worked, not just how to operate them or maintain them, but how to conceive them from nothing, how to see in his mind the path a piece of metal would take through a mechanism, where the forces would concentrate, where the wear would happen, how a design that looked elegant on paper would actually behave when it was moving at high speed under pressure. He understood manufacturing the same way. He could look at a design and understand immediately whether it could be reproduced to the tolerances required, whether the tooling existed to make it, whether a factory full of ordinary workers could build it 10,000 times over and have the 10,000th one work exactly like the first. These are gifts that no engineering school can entirely teach and no amount of money can straightforwardly buy. Garand had them naturally, in the way that some people can hear a piece of music once and reproduce it perfectly, or see a landscape and understand immediately how to paint it. In 1919, the United States Armory at Springfield, Massachusetts offered him a position as a tool designer. The Springfield Armory was the oldest continuously operating arsenal in the United States, sitting on a hill above the Connecticut River. Its red brick buildings housing the machinery and craftsmen who had been producing American military weapons since George Washington had ordered it established during the Revolutionary War. The government paid its employees modestly, and expected them to assign any patents they developed in the course of their work to the United States Army. There were no royalties. There was no path to wealth. What the job offered was security, a laboratory full of the finest machine tools in the country, and an unlimited supply of extremely interesting problems. Garand took the job and began working on the problem that the world's arms designers had declared unsolvable: the self-loading rifle. The weapon, the experts said, was too complex to manufacture, too delicate to survive in combat, and too expensive to build in quantity. He attacked it the way he attacked every mechanical problem, not as a theoretical exercise, but as a manufacturing challenge. The question was not whether a self-loading rifle could be made to work under ideal conditions. Of course it could. The question was whether it could be made to work reliably under the worst conditions imaginable, whether it could be manufactured by ordinary workers to tolerances that American industry could actually maintain, and whether it could be produced in numbers large enough to arm a modern army. He spent years on the problem, more than 15 years, in fact, working through design after design, testing mechanisms, discarding approaches that proved too fragile or too complex, refining and simplifying and testing again. He tried a primer-actuated design that used the rearward force of the cartridge primer to cycle the action, and it worked but proved unreliable under varied conditions. He redesigned it. He tried a gas-operated system that bled propellant gas from the barrel through a small port and used that gas to push back a piston that cycled the action. And this was the approach that finally proved out. Principle itself was not entirely new. Gas-operated automatic weapons had existed for decades. But Garand's genius was in the details of how he executed it: the angles of the gas port, the weight and travel of the operating rod, the geometry of the rotating bolt that locked and unlocked with each cycle, and above all, in how he designed the whole system to be manufactured. Every part was conceived from the beginning with production in mind. The tolerances were tight enough to ensure reliability, but loose enough that American factory could actually hold them. The design could be broken down and assembled by a soldier in the field without specialized tools. It was robust enough to function when it was dirty, when it was wet, when it had been dragged through mud or sand or snow. In 1936, after more than 15 years of work, the United States Army formally adopted John Garand's design as its standard infantry rifle, the United States Rifle, caliber .30 M1, the first self-loading rifle in history to become the general issue weapon of any major army on Earth. Not a special weapon for elite units, not a handful of prototypes issued to select squads. The standard rifle for every rifleman, in numbers that would eventually exceed 4 million. The rifle fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip that was inserted from the top and ejected automatically when the last round was fired, sending the empty clip upward with a distinctive metallic sound. It fired the same powerful .36 cartridge that the previous bolt-action Springfield had used, delivering the same accuracy and terminal effect. Just 8 times faster. A trained soldier with an M1 could fire 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute, more than 3 times what the best bolt-action shooter could manage. And not just trained soldiers. The genius of the design was that an ordinary man, with months of practice rather than years, could approach those numbers, because the rifle did the work that had previously required a lifetime of muscle memory to master. The Army's ordnance experts ran the numbers and then ran them again because they could not quite believe what they were seeing. A squad of 12 American riflemen armed with M1s could put out more aimed fire per minute than a much larger group of bolt-action soldiers. The gap was not marginal. It was decisive, and the Army began placing orders. The Springfield Armory began tooling up for mass production in the late 1930s, and by the time America entered the war in December of 1941, production lines were running, and the rifle was already in the hands of American soldiers. Winchester, one of America's great commercial gun manufacturers, received a contract and began building them as well. The two factories together would produce more than 4 million M1 rifles before the war ended, a figure that would have seemed impossible to the experts who had once called the self-loading infantry rifle and too complex to manufacture in quantity. None of that money went to John Garand. Not a dollar of it. His patents belonged to the government. He drew his civil servant's salary year after year, while the weapon he spent his professional life creating became the most important infantry rifle in the world. A bill was introduced in Congress during the war to award him 100-0 in recognition of what he had given his country. It never passed. He received a commendation. He received letters of thanks. He received the kind of official appreciation that costs nothing and changes nothing. He kept coming to work. He kept improving the design where he could. He stayed at Springfield Armory until he retired on an ordinary pension and went home to tinker in his workshop. Back in that Normandy hedgerow, the German sniper was learning in the most direct and irreversible way imaginable what John Garand's 15 years of quiet work had produced. The American patrol coming down the lane was not made up of expert marksmen. They were not the cream of any military tradition. They were ordinary young men from ordinary American towns and cities and farms. Men who had been civilians 18 months before that morning. Men whose entire military training occupied a fraction of the time the German sniper had spent mastering his craft. None of that mattered now. Each of them carried a rifle that reloaded itself in the fraction of a second between shots, that kept firing as fast as a man could pull a trigger, that had never once jammed in the mud and rain of the Normandy campaign. The sniper could put one round downrange in the time the worst shot in that patrol put 3. His superior skill was real. It did absolutely nothing for him. He pressed his face into the earth as the fire continued above him, methodical and relentless, and somewhere in the back of his mind, where the understanding of military reality lived beneath the immediate animal calculation of survival, something shifted. He had fought the British. He had fought the Soviets. He had never fought anything quite like this. But the story of what those rifles did to the German war machine, what happened when 4 million self-loading weapons met an army that had staked everything on the machine gun and the trained marksman, that is only beginning. Because in the weeks after D-Day, German commanders started writing urgent reports back to Berlin. Reports that described American fire discipline in terms that made no tactical sense. Reports that said the Americans seemed to be armed entirely with machine guns, that every man in an American squad fired at the rate of a support weapon, that the volume of fire coming from ordinary American infantry positions was simply unlike anything the German army had encountered from any other enemy. Those commanders did not yet know that they were not facing machine guns. They were facing John Garand's rifle, and what they were about to discover in the hedgerows and the towns and the long brutal fight across France would change everything they thought they understood about how war was won. In Part 2, we go inside the German army's desperate scramble to understand what it was facing. The moment Wehrmacht engineers got their hands on a captured M1 and the decision that came out of Berlin in late 1944 that was already, by every measure that mattered, far too late. In the summer of 1000, 944, a German sniper with 3 years of combat experience on the Eastern Front, pressed himself into a Normandy hedgerow and discovered something that shattered everything he understood about how wars were fought. He was the better shot. He had the better training. He had one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever manufactured. And none of it was enough. Because the ordinary American farm boys that committing scenes funk and scent lane each carried a rifle that fired itself. A weapon designed by a quiet French-Canadian immigrant named John Garand, who spent 15 years perfecting it in a Massachusetts arsenal and never earned a single dollar from his invention. The M1 Garand. 4 million of them. And they were just getting started. But here is what the history books rarely tell you. The rifle almost never happened. Not because the technology was wrong. Not because Garand's design was flawed. But because the men who controlled the American military in the years before the war looked at what he had built and told him, to his face, that it was a dangerous, irresponsible waste of time and money. And the man who came closest to killing the M1 Garand before it ever reached a single soldier's hands was not a German general. He was an American one. By 1934. John Garand had spent 15 years solving a problem that the world's top military engineers had declared unsolvable. His gas-operated, self-loading rifle worked. It worked reliably in mud. It worked in rain. It worked when it was dirty and when it was cold. And when it had been dragged through conditions that would have choked any mechanism the doubters had imagined. He had a design that could be manufactured at scale by ordinary factory workers, and he had the Springfield Armory's own test results to prove it. What he did not have was the Army's blessing. The man standing between Garand's rifle and the American infantry was General William D. Gruber, the Army's chief of infantry, a man who had built his career on a doctrine of marksmanship that stretched back through 2 world wars and beyond. Gruber was not stupid. He was experienced, decorated, and absolutely certain that he was right. And his certainty was rooted in something that made it very difficult to argue against: experience. He had seen what happened when soldiers were given weapons that fired quickly. He had seen the ammunition consumption figures. He had done the mathematics of supply lines and wagon trains and the logistics of keeping a modern army fed with bullets. And his conclusion, reached after decades of command, was that a self-loading rifle was the kind of gadget that looked impressive in a demonstration and became a catastrophe in the field. The confrontation came in the spring of 1934 in a conference room at the War Department in Washington. Garand was present. Several senior ordnance officers were present, and General Gruber made his position clear, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. "Mr. Garand," he said, "I have read every test report your armory has produced. I do not dispute that your mechanism functions. What I dispute is whether it should function. Give a soldier a rifle that fires itself, and you have given him permission to be wasteful. We will empty our supply lines in the first week of any serious engagement." Garand looked at him carefully. "General, the test data shows that soldiers with the M1 do not fire more rounds per engagement. They fire more rounds per minute. The difference matters." Gruber shook his head. "The difference is theoretical. In practice, when a man knows his rifle will reload without effort, he pulls the trigger more freely. That is human nature, and it does not change because of your test conditions." He paused. "I am recommending against adoption. Furthermore, I am recommending that the development budget for self-loading infantry rifles be redirected toward improving bolt-action training programs. If American soldiers shoot better, we do not need them to shoot faster." The meeting ended. Garand went back to Springfield. And for the next 2 years, the future of the rifle that would eventually arm 4 million American soldiers sat on the desk of a general who was convinced it was a mistake. The pressure on Garand during this period was not subtle. He was a civil servant, which meant his position at Springfield was secure in the technical sense. But the funding for his continued development work was not. Without Army support, the testing programs that kept his design evolving could be cut. Without testing programs, the rifle stagnated. He was not threatened with dismissal in direct terms. He did not need to be. Everyone in the building understood that a project without a champion above a certain rank was a project that died slowly, starved of resources, until there was nothing left to save. Garand kept working. He made refinements to the gas system that addressed some of the concerns about reliability under extreme conditions. He worked on the manufacturing tolerances, finding ways to tighten them without requiring tooling that American factories didn't already possess. He wrote reports. He submitted them. He waited. And then he found his unexpected ally. General Douglas MacArthur was not, by anyone's description, an easy man to approach. He was imperious, theatrical, and possessed of a self-regard that most people found difficult to navigate without losing their footing. But he was also one of the most strategically astute officers in the American military, and he had been watching the development of European and Asian military technology with an attention that most of his peers were not paying. MacArthur had seen the early reports from China, where Japanese infantry tactics were demonstrating the devastating effect of volume of fire over individual marksmanship. He had read the analyses coming out of the Spanish Civil War, where automatic weapons had repeatedly shown that the speed of fire mattered more than the precision of any individual shot in the chaos of actual close-range combat. And he had, quietly, asked one of his staff officers to obtain the Springfield Armory's test results on Garand's rifle and summarize them without editorial comment. The summary landed on his desk in late 1935. MacArthur read it twice. Then he called for a formal demonstration. The conditions Garand was given were specific and unforgiving. He had one opportunity. The demonstration would take place at Fort Myer, Virginia, in front of a selection board that included both supporters and opponents of the self-loading rifle concept. He would have 30 minutes to make his case. If the rifle failed in any meaningful way during that window, the program would be formally closed and the development budget reallocated. Garand had 6 weeks to prepare. The morning of the demonstration was cold and damp, the kind of October weather that made metal contracts slightly, and lubricants liquinin, ways that could matter enormously in a precision mechanism. Garand arrived before dawn and spent 2 hours going over every rifle in the demonstration batch, checking each one with the methodical calm of a man who had learned long ago that thoroughness was the only answer to anxiety. The selection board arrived at 9 in the morning. 14 officers, some of them openly skeptical, several of them actively hostile to the project. General Gruber was present. He stood with his arms crossed and watched Garand set up the demonstration range with an expression that suggested he was performing a courtesy he had not requested and did not value. MacArthur was not present in person. He had sent a representative, a colonel named James Ulio, with instructions to observe everything and report back without omission. The demonstration began with a baseline comparison. 6 soldiers with standard bolt-action Springfield rifles, all of them experienced marksmen who had been practicing for the specific purpose of showing the bolt action at its best. They fired at man-sized targets at 300 yards for 60 seconds. The results were recorded. 41 rounds fired, 34 hits. A respectable performance from trained men doing exactly what they had been trained to do. Then Garand stepped back, and 6 soldiers with M1 rifles took their positions. These men had been selected deliberately from the lower third of their unit's marksmanship scores. Not the worst shots available, but clearly not the best. Men who would represent the average American infantryman rather than the ideal. The signal was given. They fired. The sound was immediate and total. Not the measured crack of deliberate bolt-action fire, but a continuous rolling thunder that did not pause, did not break, did not give anyone watching time to count individual shots, because the individual shots had become something else entirely. 60 seconds passed. The results were collected and calculated. 112 rounds fired. 97 hits. The range went quiet. Several officers leaned forward to look at the numbers again. Gruber uncrossed his arms. Not because he was convinced. Garand could see that in his face. But because the numbers had surprised him in a way he had not prepared for and was not yet sure how to process. The second phase of the demonstration was the one Garand had designed specifically to address Gruber's central objection about reliability. Before the firing began, he had each rifle dragged through a pit of wet Virginia clay and then dunked in a water barrel. The soldiers worked them by hand to clear the worst of the mud, wiped the exterior surfaces with their sleeves, and then loaded them without any further cleaning. Every rifle fired. Not one jam. Not one failure to feed or eject. The mechanisms cycled through the mud-thickened gas ports with the same mechanical indifference they had shown on a clean range. Colonel Ulio Plowo wrote in his report to MacArthur that evening that he had witnessed something he would not have believed possible from reading the specifications alone, and that, in his professional opinion, the Army's infantry capability, without the M1 Garand, would represent a strategic deficit that no amount of training could compensate for. MacArthur read the report. 3 days later, he formally backed adoption. The Army adopted the M1 Garand as its standard infantry rifle in January of 1936. General Gruber accepted the decision with the correct military bearing of a man who has been overruled by someone above his rank. He never publicly recanted his objections. He did not need to. The rifle answered them for him, over and over. On every front the war would eventually produce. But adoption was one thing. Production was another. And the gap between those two realities would consume the next 5 years, and very nearly defeat the entire project before a single M1 ever reached the hands of a combat soldier. Springfield Armory began retooling its production lines for the new rifle in 1936. And almost immediately, the manufacturing challenges that Garand's critics had predicted began to materialize, not because the design was wrong, but because the scale was unlike anything the arsenal had attempted. The tolerances on the gas system required machinery that had to be purpose-built, and the purpose-built machinery took time to design, fabricate, and calibrate. The wood stocks required a drying and treatment process that could not be rushed without producing components that would more producing and crack under field conditions. Training machinists to work to the required specifications required months of instruction for workers who had never operated equipment of this precision. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the world understood that the war it had been dreading had finally arrived, Springfield was producing M1 rifles at a rate of roughly 200 per day. The United States Army had approximately 880 of them in inventory. An army that intended to expand to several million men needed a very different number. Winchester Repeating Arms received a production contract in 1939 and began the same painful retooling process. The two factories together, running at maximum capacity, would need years to catch up with the demand that a world war would generate. Soldiers at the front who received the M1 in these early years had to be trained on a weapon that their sergeants had never seen before, using manuals that were still being written. In units where half the men still carried the old bolt-action Springfield because there were not yet enough MM1s to go around. The transition was managed unevenly, as all large institutional changes are, by the combination of official orders and the informal resistance of men who had learned their craft on one weapon and saw no compelling reason to start again. There were sergeants who told their men quietly, that the M1 was a delicate piece of machinery that would get them killed when it jammed at the wrong moments. There were units where the M1 arrived and sat in its crates because the unit's armorers had not yet been trained to service it. There were range officers who ran qualification programs on the old Springfield because they knew how to score them and did not want to rebuild their training programs from scratch. And through all of this, John Garand kept coming to work. He answered questions. He traveled to units to demonstrate the rifle's reliability. He sat with armorers and walked them through the maintenance procedures until they were comfortable. He was not a dynamic personality. He was not the kind of man who commanded a room with his presence. He was a toolmaker who happened to have built one of the most important weapons in the history of modern warfare, and he explained it, the way he explained everything, with patience and precision and the quiet confidence of someone who has looked at a problem long enough to understand it completely. By 1943, the production lines were running at the scale the war required. By 1944, the M1 Garand was in the hands of nearly every American infantryman in Europe and the Pacific, and the Germans, who had dismissed the self-loading infantry rifle as the kind of wasteful industrial gadget that only a soft democracy would build, had begun finding them on the battlefield, picking them up, turning them over, working the action, and understanding, in the way that soldiers understand things that generals sometimes do not, that the men who had built this weapon had seen something that Germany had not. The Wehrmacht's Ordnance Command issued a formal assessment of the M1 Garand in late 1943. The document, classified at the highest level, noted that the rifle represented a fundamental shift in infantry firepower doctrine and recommended accelerated development of German self-loading alternatives. It was a sober, professional document written by men who understood exactly what they were looking at. The assessment reached Berlin in December of 1943. By that point, Germany had been trying to develop its own self-loading infantry rifles for 3 years and had produced the Gewehr 41, a functional but overly complex weapon that required more skilled manufacturing than German industry could sustain at war scale. The improved Gewehr 43 was in development. The Sturmgewehr 44, the weapon that would become the world's first true assault rifle, was being finalized. German engineers understood the problem, and they were working on the answer. They were also 4 years behind a man who had started solving it in 1919 in a government arsenal in Massachusetts. But as those German engineers bent over their drawing boards in the winter of 1943, racing to close a gap they now understood was real and decisive, something else was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. Something that would make their race irrelevant before it was finished. American intelligence was intercepting communications that suggested Germany had distributed detailed technical assessments of the M1 to every major weapons development center in the Reich. They were not just studying it. They were attempting to copy specific elements of its gas system. And that meant they knew precisely what they were trying to match. A weapon that an enemy studied this carefully was a weapon that frightened them. And a frightened enemy was capable of things that a confident one was not. In Part 3, we follow what happened when German engineers finally got their answer off the drawing board and into production, why it came too late, and how a single decision made in a Berlin office in 1944 accelerated the end of the war by a margin that historians are still calculating. The weapon Germany built was brilliant. The factory that was supposed to build it in numbers was about to cease to exist. And the man responsible for that was not a general, not a strategist, and not a soldier. He was a navigator in a B-17 from Ohio who had never heard of John Garand. In Part 1, a quiet French-Canadian toolmaker named John Garand spent 15 years building a self-loading rifle that the world's military experts had declared impossible, wasteful, and dangerous. In Part 2, that rifle survived bureaucratic assassination at the hands of a Tendrain-Zero, who was certain it would empty America's supply wagons, found its champion in Douglas MacArthur, passed a demonstration that silenced its most vocal critics, and began rolling off production lines in numbers that the Springfield Armory had never attempted before. By 1944, more than 4 million M1 Garands were in the hands of American infantrymen. On every front the war had produced. The cliffhanger was this: German engineers had studied the M1 in detail. They understood what it was. They were racing to build their answer. And a navigator from Ohio flying B-17 over Germany was about to make that race irrelevant. Now it is the winter of 1944, and the Germans have stopped being confused. They have started being afraid. In October 1943, the Wehrmacht's Ordnance Analysis Division completed a classified technical assessment of the M1 Garand based on field-captured specimens, prisoner interrogations, and battlefield performance data collected from engagements in North Africa and Sicily. The document ran to 41 pages. Its conclusion, written in the careful, unemotional language of professional military analysis, stated that American infantry firepower per rifleman exceeded German infantry firepower per rifleman by a factor of approximately 3-to-1 in sustained aimed fire. It recommended, in the strongest possible terms, immediate acceleration of German self-loading rifle development. The document landed on the desks of senior Wehrmacht commanders who had spent 4 years confident in the superiority of German individual soldier training. It landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward in ways that the document's authors had not fully anticipated. Then, field commanders in France and Italy began receiving reports from their units that described American infantry tactics in terms that did not fit the established doctrine they had trained against. German soldiers who had fought the British in North Africa, who had fought the Soviets on the Eastern Front, who understood what volume of fire from a trained enemy looked like, were writing in their after-action reports that American infantry firepower felt categorically different, not better trained, not more aggressive, just faster, always faster. A German squad that took a defensive position and began engaging an American patrol expected to trade shots at a pace that German marksmanship training had prepared them for. What they received instead was a volume of fire that felt disproportionate to the number of men generating it. German casualties in infantry engagements against American units in Italy during the winter of 1943 to 1944 ran approximately 40% higher than predicted by German tactical models based on the force ratios involved. 40%. In a war being fought at the margins, where every casualty represented a trained soldier who could not be easily replaced. That gap was not a statistical artifact. It was a strategic problem. General Fridolin von Senger und Ederlin, commanding German forces in Italy, wrote in his operational diary in February 1944 that infantry was achieving fire superiority in engagements where German tactical position, training, and terrain advantage should have favored the defender. He identified the M1 Garand as the primary factor and requested priority to Guy of Gewehr 43 self-loading rifles for his units. The request was processed through the appropriate channels. It was partially filled 6 months later. By then, the situation had changed in ways that made the question of small arms supply secondary to questions of survival. The German response at the command level was rational and professional, and completely inadequate to the scale of the problem. They accelerated Gewehr 43 production. They issued tactical guidance directing soldiers to concentrate fire on the brief reloading pauses they believed American soldiers must experience. They studied the M1's 8-round capacity and built tactical doctrine around the moment of clip change, those few seconds when, in theory, an American rifleman was temporarily unable to fire. The problem was that American squads overlapped their fire. When one man was reloading, 4 others were not. The theoretical window the Germans had identified did not exist in practice. But this was not the only problem John Garand's rifle was creating, not the only crisis demanding answers. Because in the spring of 1944, something unexpected happened on the American side. The M1 Garand began to fail, not in the field, in the accounting offices. The ammunition consumption figures that General Gruber had warned about in 1934 had materialized, not in the catastrophic form he had predicted, but in a form that created genuine logistical stress at the theater level. American infantrymen with M1 Garands were consuming ammunition at rates that exceeded pre-war supply planning by between 60 and 80% in sustained infantry engagements. The rifles were working exactly as designed. The soldiers were firing them at the rate the design permitted. And the supply lines, built on pre-war consumption models derived from bolt-action weapons, were struggling to keep pace. In March 1944, a logistics officer at the First Army's Supply Command submitted a report to General Omar Bradley's staff that identified a potential ammunition shortfall in the projected Normandy campaign that could, under certain engagement intensity scenarios, leave frontline infantry units with less than 2 days of combat ammunition. The report moved through the staff with the quiet urgency of a document that nobody wanted to be responsible for having ignored. Bradley's logistics team began emergency revisions to the supply plan. Ammunition tonnage allocation was increased by 35%. Additional Liberty ships were added to the cross-channel supply schedule. General Gruber, had he been alive to see the report, would have found in it something resembling validation. He would also have been wrong about what it meant. Because the same engagements that were consuming American ammunition at unprecedented rates were also producing American tactical results at unprecedented rates. Units that were burning through their ammunition faster were also achieving their objectives faster, taking fewer casualties in the process, and requiring fewer follow-on engagements to clear positions that would have taken multiple assaults under the old bolt-action arithmetic. The ammunition cost per objective captured, when anyone calculated it honestly, was lower with the M1 than it had been without it. Bradley looked at the logistics report and the tactical results report together and made the only decision the numbers supported. He increased the ammunition allocation and said nothing publicly about it, because the last thing he needed 2 months before the largest amphibious operation in history was a debate about whether the standard infantry rifle was creating supply problems. The M1 Garand would go to Normandy. All 4 million of them. June 6, 1944. The English Channel. 400 hours. The largest naval armada in human history is moving toward the coast of France in darkness. 156 0 men. 50 ships. 11 aircraft standing by. The operational codename is Overlord. The men in the landing craft do not think about operational codenames. They think about the water coming over the sides and whether their rifles are going to work after they get wet. Private First Class James Hendricks of the 1st Infantry Division, C Company, 16th Infantry Regiment, is 22 years old. He is from a town called Findlay, Ohio. 6 months ago, he was working in a machine shop. His M1 Garand is in its waterproof bag, and he is thinking about nothing except getting off the landing craft and reaching the sand without drowning. The ramp drops at 633. Omaha Beach, Dog Green Sector. Hendricks runs. The fire coming from the bluffs is immediate and total. German defensive positions that Allied air and naval bombardment had failed to destroy open up on the landing craft, and the men pouring out of them, with every weapon the defenders possess: machine guns, mortars, rifles, artillery. Men fall in the surf. Men fall on the sand. The beach in the first minutes of the landing is the kind of chaos that no training can fully prepare a human being for. And the men of C Company are moving through it because the only option available to them that does not end with drowning or capture is to move forward. Hendricks reaches the beach. His rifle bag has been torn away, somewhere in the water. The M1 is exposed and soaked with salt water, and he works the bolt by hand to clear any obstruction and chambers around, and it fires. It fires again. The gas system, the same gas system that John Garand had tested in mud and rain, and every condition he could imagine in a Massachusetts arsenal, is working in the saltwater chaos of Omaha Beach. C Company reaches the base of the bluffs. 12 men of the 193 who landed. The rest are on the beach or in the water. 12 men with M1 Garands, and the bluffs above them are still defended. What happens next is not in the official after-action reports in the detail that it deserves. What happens is that 12 ordinary American soldiers with self-loading rifles, begin moving upward through terrain that should be impossible to assault with those numbers. They are not trained commandos. They are not elite infantry. They are survivors of a catastrophic landing who have reached the high ground because there is no other direction available to them. The German position at the top of that section of bluff holds approximately 30 defenders. In the first exchange of fire, the volume of rounds coming up from 12 M1 Garands is sufficient to force those defenders to keep their heads down rather than aim deliberately, not suppress them into permanent inaction, but disrupt the careful aimed fire that had been slaughtering men on the beach below. The 12 men take the position. 6 of them are still standing when it is over. By noon on June 6, American forces have established a foothold on Omaha's beach that German command had considered operationally impossible given the defensive preparations. The cost has been catastrophic. More than 2,000 Americans are dead or wounded on that beach alone. But the foothold exists. And by evening, German counterattack planning at the 352nd Infantry Division headquarters has identified a problem that their planning documents had not adequately addressed. The Americans on top of those bluffs are not running out of firepower. They are not falling back to consolidate. They are receiving ammunition resupply from the beach below of, and they are firing at a rate that the German counterattack formations cannot approach without suffering casualties that the local commander judges unacceptable for the tactical objective available. The 352nd Division's counterattack is delayed, then modified, then downgraded, then canceled. The foothold holds. By the end of June 6, 1,944, 156 Allied soldiers are ashore in Normandy. The German 7th Army's after-action report, compiled over the following days, identifies American infantry firepower as a primary factor in the failure of defensive positions that should, by established doctrine, have been able to hold against the attacking force ratios. The report uses the phrase unanticipated volume of aimed fire 4 times in describing different sectors where American infantry breached prepared defensive positions. Unanticipated volume of aimed fire. That was John Garand's rifle. That was 15 years of quiet work in a Massachusetts arsenal, by a man who drew a civil servant's salary and never received a royalty check. The effect cascaded outward from Normandy in ways that multiplied the initial impact faster than anyone had projected. As American units broke out of the beachhead and began the drive across France, unit commanders who had been skeptical of the M1's advantages in defense operations discovered what it meant to have it in offensive operations, where movement and speed of engagement mattered more than prepared positions. The German Army's tactical manual had been built on a fundamental assumption. The assumption was that, at close range, in the confused and rapid engagements of mobile warfare, the side with more and better machine guns would dominate. The German squad was organized around this principle. The MG-42 machine gun, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, was the centerpiece of German small unit tactics, and everything else the squad did was in service of that weapon. What the American advance across France demonstrated, in engagement after engagement, was that an entire squad of men with M1 Garands could generate sufficient fit fire to suppress an MG-42 position long enough for part of the squad to maneuver and destroy it. The weapon that had been designed to be the heart of German defensive tactics had a counter that the designers of those tactics had not built into their doctrine, because the counter depended on every rifleman in the opposing squad having a weapon that fired faster than any trained man could work a bolt. German units in France began taking casualties at rates that exceeded their replacement capacity in July 1944, not because of air power alone, not because of armor alone, but because in the infantry engagements that determined who held terrain at the end of each day, the arithmetic of firepower had shifted in a way that German tactical skill could not compensate for. A German squad of 10 men defending a hedgerow could produce, at maximum trained performance, perhaps 120 aimed shots per minute. An American squad of 12 men attacking that same hedgerow could produce, at average untrained performance, more than 400. The numbers did not leave room for heroism to matter. By September 1944, American forces had liberated Paris, cleared most of France, and pushed into Belgium and the Netherlands. The Wehrmacht had suffered losses in the West that its manpower base could not sustain. Replacements arriving at the front were younger, less trained, and less experienced than the soldiers they were replacing. The gap between German individual soldier quality and American individual soldier quality, never as large as German doctrine had assumed, was becoming irrelevant as the gap in firepower per man continued to grow. General Patton's Third Army, advancing at a pace that German defensive planning had not considered possible, attributed a significant portion of its operational tempo to the M1's effect on infantry engagement duration. Fights that would have taken hours under bolt-action conditions were resolving in minutes. Positions that would have required artillery preparation and set-piece assault were being taken by infantry moving fast and firing faster. The operational tempo that made Patton's advance so difficult for German command to respond to was partly a product of tanks and aircraft and logistics, and partly, in a way that the official histories understate, a product of a semi-automatic rifle designed by a deaf toolmaker from Quebec. German prisoners captured in France in the summer and fall of 1944 were asked routinely about their assessment of American weapons. The M1 Garand appeared in those interrogation reports with a frequency that ordnance analysts found significant. Soldiers who had fought the British, who had fought the Soviets, who had experience against every major Allied infantry force, consistently identified the American rifle as qualitatively different from what they had faced elsewhere, not because of its caliber, not because of its accuracy, because of its speed, because of the way it changed the pace of every engagement into something that German-trained reflexes, built around the rhythm of bolt-action fire, could not match. One captured sergeant from the 12th SS Panzer Division, interviewed by American intelligence officers in August 1944, described the experience of being on the receiving end of a squad of M1s in terms that the intelligence transcribed verbatim and forwarded to Army headquarters. He said that fighting Americans felt like fighting men who had 3 times as many soldiers as you could see, that every American position seemed to have more rifles than the number of men occupying it. that the fire never stopped long enough to move against it. He did not know the name John Garand. He had never heard of Springfield. He knew only what it felt like to be on the wrong side of what Garand had built. By the end of 1944, German industrial production of both the Gewehr 43 and the Sturmgewehr 44 had been severely disrupted by Allied strategic bombing. The factories that were supposed to close the gap between German and American infantry firepower were operating at 30 to 40% of planned capacity. Skilled workers had been conscripted. Machine tools had been destroyed or relocated. The supply of critical raw materials had been interrupted by bombing and the advancing Allied ground forces. Germany had understood the problem. Germany could not solve the problem. Not anymore. And through all of it, in a red brick building on a hill, above the Connecticut River in Springfield, Massachusetts, John Garand kept coming to work. The rifles kept rolling off the line. The gap kept widening. And the war kept moving toward its conclusion at a pace that the Sturmgewehr 44, brilliant as it was, could not alter because it existed in thousands where the M1 existed in millions. But there is something about this story that the casualty figures and the tactical analyses and the production statistics do not capture. Something about what it meant for the man who built the rifle when the war ended, and the world stopped needing it in quite the same desperate quantities. Because John Garand went home to his workshop in Springfield, and Congress went home to its business. And the bill that would have paid him $100,000 for the weapon that had armed the largest army in American history died in committee without a vote. The story of what happened to John Garand after the war, what he received and what he was denied, and what his rifle became in the decades that followed, is the chapter of this history that almost no one tells. And it may be the most important chapter of all, because the question of what a nation owes the quiet men who save it is a question that does not end when the shooting stops. It only becomes harder to answer when the urgency has passed and the gratitude has faded and the man himself is still sitting in his workshop, still tinkering, still drawing his civil servant's salary, still waiting for a recognition that the country he had armed beyond all precedent somehow never got around to providing. That story is part 4, and it is the one that will stay with you longest. A French-Canadian toolmaker spent 15 years in a Massachusetts arsenal building a rifle the world's best military minds had declared impossible. He survived bureaucratic's assassination by a general who was certain the design was wasteful, found his champion in Douglas MacArthur, passed a demonstration that converted his skeptics, and watched 4 million copies of his work roll off production lines and into the hands of ordinary American men who would use them to overwhelm some of the most experienced soldiers in human history. The M1 Garand changed the arithmetic of infantry combat so completely that German commanders wrote urgent reports to Berlin describing ordinary American soldiers as though they were armed with machine guns. The rifle broke the hedgerows of Normandy, crossed France, and reached the Rhine. The war ended. The shooting stopped. Then the question that the casualty statistics and the production statistics had never addressed finally arrived. What happened to the man who built it? The answer is the part of this story that makes you sit quietly for a moment and think about what a nation's gratitude is actually worth when it is measured against what it owes. John Garand did not receive a hero's welcome in 1945. He did not retire to a lecture circuit or a consulting fortune or a named chair at a university. He went back to work because the Springfield Armory was still there, and there were still improvements to be made to the design. And there were still problems on his workbench that nobody else in the building was better positioned to solve. And he was the kind of man who, when there were problems on his workbench, solved them. He had spent the war years doing what he always did, answering questions from unit armorers who didn't understand a particular maintenance procedure. making refinements to the gas system that improved reliability under extreme cold, a problem that had emerged in the Aleutian Islands campaign, where temperatures dropped far below anything Massachusetts winters produced. Writing technical bulletins, visiting production lines to address manufacturing questions that the Winchester engineers and his own Springfield Spring colleagues couldn't resolve without him. He was present, available, useful, and invisible in the way that men who work with their hands and their minds, rather than their rank and their rhetoric, tend to be invisible inside large institutions. The financial reality of his position was this. He was a GS-level government employee, which meant his salary in 1,945 was something in the range of $4,000 per year. The patents on the M1 Garand belonged to the United States government, as all patents developed by government employees in the course of their official duties belonged to the government under the law as it existed then. He had not negotiated a royalty arrangement when he took the job in 1919. The concept had not been on the table. He was a toolmaker hired to design tools for the Army's arsenal, and the tools he designed belonged to the Army. More than 4 million M1 rifles had been manufactured under his patents during the war, at a production cost of approximately $40 per rifle in wartime contracts. The total manufacturing value of his design exceeded $160 million in 1,945 currency. He received none of it, not a dollar, not a cent. His contribution to the victory that had just been celebrated with ticker tape, parades, and radio broadcast, and the largest collective exhale in American history, was compensated at the same rate as his contribution to any other week he had spent at Springfield working on any other problem. Congress, to its partial credit, recognized that this was inadequate. A bill was introduced in 1944 award John Garand $100,000 in recognition of what his rifle had meant to the war effort. The amount was a fraction of the value his design had generated. It was the kind of number that gestures at acknowledgement without approaching adequacy. And it never passed. It was introduced, referred to committee, and died there without a vote, overtaken by the 1,000 other demands on legislative attention in the closing year of the largest war in human history. A second attempt was made after the war. It also failed. Garand continued to draw his civil servant's salary. He continued to come to work. He continued to make improvements to designs that carried his name in the Army's inventory, and not in any bank account that he controlled. He was awarded the Meritorious Civilian Service Award in 1941, a commendation that acknowledged his contribution, with the kind of formal language that governments use when they want to express gratitude without spending money. He received the Medal for Merit in 1944. He received letters. He received certificates. He received, from General George Patton personally, a handwritten note describing the M1 as the greatest battle implement ever devised, which was a remarkable thing to receive, from a man who did not distribute praise easily or cheaply. He put the letters in a drawer and went back to work. What Garand said about his situation, in the few interviews he gave during his lifetime, was characterized by the same quality that defined everything else about him. He did not rage against the injustice of it. He did not campaign publicly for compensation. He did not hire lawyers or lobby Congress or write a memoir designed to build pressure for recognition. He said, in words that varied slightly across different interviews, but carried the same essential content, that he had been paid to do a job, that he had done the job to the best of his ability, and that the rifle had worked the way it was supposed to work, and that this was, in the end, the point of the entire enterprise. He had not built the M1 Garand to become wealthy. He had built it because it was a problem worth solving, and he was the person best positioned to solve it. This is either the most admirable thing you will ever hear about a human being, or a reflection of how completely an institution can shape a person's understanding of what they are entitled to expect from the world. Perhaps it is both simultaneously, and perhaps the distinction does not matter as much as the fact itself, which is that John Garand retired from Springfield Armory in 1953 on a standard government pension, went home to his house in Springfield, Massachusetts, and spent the next 20 years doing what he had always done when he was not at work. He tinkered. He skated. He worked on mechanisms that interested him for reasons that had nothing to do with military applications. He was, by all accounts from people who knew him in those years, a contented man in the way that people who have found the work they were meant to do and done it fully are sometimes contented, regardless of whether the world has compensated them appropriately for having done it. He died on February 16, 1974. He was 86 years old, but the rifle did not die with him. The M1 Garand's influence on the subsequent history of infantry weapons is a story that operates on two levels simultaneously. On the surface level, it is a story about the direct operational life of the weapon itself, which continued long after 1945. On the deeper level, it is a story about how the M1 proved a concept that every subsequent infantry weapon in the world would be built around, a concept that Garand's critics had spent decades insisting was impractical, wasteful, and impossible to manufacture at scale. The M1 Garand served as the standard American infantry rifle through the Korean War, where American soldiers faced Chinese and North Korean forces armed primarily with Soapsate bolt-chankmaken weapons, and found themselves in precisely the same tactical position that German soldiers had found themselves in 1944, on the wrong side of a firepower differential that training could not compensate for. The rifle's performance in Korea reinforced every conclusion, reinforced every coin the Army had drawn from the Second World War, and generated the same pattern of enemy after-action analysis that the Wehrmacht had produced. Chinese military observers in Korea documented the American firepower advantage with the same professional precision that German ordnance analysts had applied in 1943. The rifle remained in limited service into the early years of the Vietnam War, where its characteristics proved less suited to the close-range jungle engagements of Southeast Asia than the lighter, higher-capacity weapons that would replace it. The M14, which succeeded the M1 as the standard American rifle in 1957, was in most essential respects a direct evolution of Garand's design, using the same gas-operated rotating bolt principle, with modifications to the feeding system, and a switch to the 7.62mm NATO cartridge. The M16, which replaced the M14 in Vietnam, abandoned some of Garand's specific mechanical solutions, but operated on the same fundamental principle of gas-operated self-loading that he had spent 15 years proving was not only possible but necessary. Every major military power in the world had adopted self-loading or fully automatic infantry rifles by the mid-1950s. The Soviet AK-47, perhaps the most produced and widely distributed infantry weapon in human history, with an estimated 100 million units manufactured, operates on a gas-operated rotating bolt principle that shares its fundamental engineering ancestry with the M1 Garand, executed through a different mechanical path toward the same conclusion that Garand had reached 20 years earlier, the German Sturmgewehr 44, which had pointed the direction toward the assault rifle concept before German industry could produce it in meaningful numbers, informed the AK-47's design philosophy, even as the AK-47's specific mechanisms drew on Soviet engineering traditions. The bolt-action rifle, the weapon whose superiority over any self-loading alternative the world's military establishments had defended with Such confidence in 1935 effectively disappeared from frontline infantry service within a decade of the Second World War's end. The consensus that Garand had spent 15 years working against, the consensus that had nearly buried his design in a War Department committee, had been so completely overturned by the war's results that within 10 years of its conclusion, the position those experts had held seemed not merely wrong, but almost incomprehensible. Approximately 50 nations currently field infantry rifles that trace their operating principle directly to gas-operated self-loading mechanisms that John Garand proved was manufacturable at scale in the 1930s. The principle is so universal that the question is no longer whether an infantry rifle should be self-loading, but only what caliber it should fire, how many rounds it should carry, and what accessories it should accept. The argument that Garand won has been so thoroughly won that the itself has been forgotten. What this means, in the broadest accounting, is that the tactical doctrine of every infantry force on Earth for the past 70 years has been built on a foundation that a partially deaf French-Canadian toolmaker established in a Massachusetts government arsenal while drawing a salary that never exceeded what a mid-level factory foreman would have considered modest. The number of lives that this change in doctrine has affected, directly and indirectly, is not calculable in any rigorous sense, but the number of M1 Garands and their direct descendants that have been manufactured worldwide, across all nations and all conflicts from 1936 to the present day, exceeds 150 million. That is not a measure of lives saved or lost. It is a measure of how completely one man's solution to a problem displaced every alternative that the world's military establishments had considered adequate. The bravest thing about John Garand was not that he kept working when General Gruber told him his rifle was a dangerous mistake. Many people persist in the face of institutional opposition when they believe they are right. The bravest thing was the quiet, unconditional nature of his commitment to the work itself, independent of what the work would return to him personally. He did not build the M1 Garand as a vehicle for wealth or recognition. He built it because it was the right answer to an important problem, and because he was constitutionally incapable of leaving an important problem unsolved when he could see the solution. This distinction matters because it is rarer than it sounds. The history of innovation, military and civilian both, is full of people who pursued important ideas partly because they believed in the idea and partly because they believed in what the idea would do for them. There is nothing wrong with this. The combination of genuine conviction and personal ambition produced most transformative technologies in human history. But Garand's case stands apart precisely because the personal ambition element was, by every available evidence, so minimal. He had the conviction. He lacked, or declined to exercise, the ambition to translate that conviction into personal advantage even when the opportunity existed. The institutions that surround innovation, in the military and elsewhere, are almost always structured in ways that resist the kind of contribution Garand made. They reward rank over insight, consensus over originality, and the defense of established positions over the willingness to acknowledge that established positions might be wrong. General Gruber was not a corrupt man or a stupid one. He was a product of a system that had rewarded certain kinds of certainty for decades, and his certainty about the self-loading rifle was the same certainty that had made him effective in every other context the system had asked him to navigate. The system had no mechanism for distinguishing between his confidence in things he was right about and his confidence in things he was wrong about, because the system did not value the distinction. Garand survived that system because of MacArthur, and MacArthur intervened because he was one of the rare senior officers whose strategic curiosity exceeded his institutional comfort. And because the timing of the demonstration, the Evans timesing gave the evidence sufficient space to speak for itself before the institutional machinery could close around it. This combination of factors, a technically rigorous solution, an unexpected champion with sufficient rank, and a demonstration that produced results too dramatic to dismiss, is probably the minimum viable set of conditions required for a genuinely disruptive idea to survive inside a large military institution. Remove any one of those elements, and the M1 Garand likely dies in committee in 1934, and the American infantryman goes to Normandy with a bolt-action rifle. And the casualty figures at Omaha Beach are higher than the catastrophic figures they already were. Now here is the detail that most people who know the broad outline of John Garand's story do not know. The detail that was not widely publicized during his lifetime and that only emerged with any clarity in the decades after his death, as archives were opened and personal papers were examined. And the people who had worked alongside him in Springfield wrote down what they remembered. Garand knew, from at least 1,942, that the congressional effort to compensate him was failing. He had been told, through chances were informal or funtress or first-screen informal enough to preserve the dignity of the people delivering the information, that the legislative momentum behind the compensation bill was insufficient and that it was unlikely to pass. He understood what this meant financially. He was not a naive man about money. He had lived carefully within his civil servant's income for 30 years, and he understood the difference between what he had and what he might have had. And he had made a clear-eyed peace with that difference. What the archives reveal, and what was not publicly known during his lifetime, is that Garand was approached at least twice by private manufacturers who were interested in licensing agreements that would have generated royalty income on commercial variants of his design. These approaches came through intermediaries and were carefully structured to avoid any appearance of impropriety. The manufacturers in question were legitimate companies with legitimate business purposes. The licensing arrangements they proposed would have been legal. The income would have been substantial. Garand declined both approaches. His stated reason, conveyed through the same intermediaries, was that he was not certain such arrangements would be consistent with his obligations as a government employee, and that he was not willing to risk creating any appearance that his government work and his private interests might conflict. He was not required by law to decline. He chose to, and in choosing to, he foreclosed the only realistic avenue by which he might have converted the value of his work into personal financial security. The first prototype, M1 Garand, serial number 1, the rifle that Garand had carried through the final stages of development, and the Army's adoption process, remained in his personal possession after his retirement. It was the one physical artifact of his working life that he kept close. When he died in 1974, it passed to the Springfield Armory, National Historic Site, where it is held today in a collection that preserves the physical history of American military manufacturing. It is a plain, functional object. It does not look like something that changed the world. It looks like a rifle, well made and carefully maintained, with the kind of honest craftsmanship that reflects a maker who cared about the work for its own sake, rather than for the impression it would create. There are no decorative elements. There is no ornamentation. It is exactly what it was designed to be, nothing more and nothing less. And in that quality it reflects the man who made it so completely that looking at it becomes a kind of biography. From a government arsenal in Massachusetts, built by a man who emigrated from Quebec with no money and no connections and no credential beyond the extraordinary clarity, feat, with which he could see how metal moved through mechanisms, a rifle emerged that armed 4 million ordinary Americans and gave each of them the firepower that a generation of military doctrine had reserved for specialists and machine gunners. It went to North Africa, to Sicily, to Normandy, to the Hurtgen Forest, to the Pacific Islands whose names became synonymous with the hardest fighting of the war. It was in the hands of men who survived the war and men who did not. It fired more than 1 billion rounds in American service before it was replaced by weapons that operated on the same principle. Its creator had spent 15 years proving was sound. John Garand never became wealthy. He never became famous in the way that generals and politicians and weapons designers who cultivate their own legends become famous. He was not written about in the popular press during the war. His name does not appear in most of the histories that describe the campaigns his rifle made possible. He is the answer to a question that most people, the M1 Garand, have never thought to ask, which is, who made this, and what became of him? The answer is that a partially deaf immigrant toolmaker made it, in a government building, on a government salary, under a legal framework that gave him no claim to any portion of the extraordinary value his work generated. And what became of him is that he went home, and he tinkered in his workshop, and he skated on the ponds in Springfield in the winter, and he died at 86 in the city, where he had done the work that won the war, in the modest financial circumstances that the system he had served without complaint had provided for him. There is a word for the quality that John Garand embodied across 50 years of work, across bureaucratic obstruction and institutional indifference and financial arrangements that any reasonable accounting would call unjust. The word is not genius, though he was that. It is not persistence, though he demonstrated that absolutely. The word is integrity, in the oldest and most structural sense of the term, meaning a person whose interior and exterior are the same, who does the same quality of work whether anyone is watching or not, who pursues the right answer because it is the right answer, and not because of what finding it will return to him. 4 million rifles, more than 400,000 American soldiers who came home from the Second World War. Who might not have, under a different arithmetic of infantry firepower, a shift in military doctrine so complete that within a decade of the war's end, the position that Garand had spent 15 years fighting to overturn had become so thoroughly overturned that the people who had held it seemed, in microspect, not merely wrong but almost incomprehensible. That is what one quiet man, with the right idea and the absolute commitment to see it through regardless of the personal cost, was able to accomplish. And the most remarkable thing about John Garand is not what he built. It is that he built it anyway, without the prospect of wealth, without the guarantee of recognition, without any certainty that the institution he was working inside would ever allow his solution to reach the problem it was designed to solve. He built it because the problem existed, and he could see the answer, and that was, in the end, sufficient reason. In a century full of people who changed the world for reasons that had everything to do with what the world would give them in return, John Garand changed the world for a reason that had nothing to do with that at all. And the world, in its characteristic fashion, gave him a commendation, a pension, and a workshop to tinker in, and called the account settled. The rifle disagreed. It kept firing long after the man who made it had been forgotten. It keeps firing still, and every soldier in every army in the world who carries a self-loading rifle today is carrying, in some fundamental mechanical sense, the work of a government toolmaker from Springfield who loved machines and never made a dollar. That is the American story this rifle tells, not the story of a nation that rewards its quiet heroes adequately, but the story of what a single human being with the right idea and the unconditional will to pursue it can accomplish, even inside a system designed, in almost every structural detail, to prevent exactly that from happening.